Venezuela pushes the world closer to conflict, and no one is talking about why. Let me take you back to January 10 of this year. That's the day Nicolas Maduro stood before Venezuela's National Assembly and declared, with all the theatrical flair of a man who knows the cameras are rolling, that his government would reclaim the Essequibo, a vast, oil-rich territory currently under Guyanese control. The official statement was framed as a matter of national sovereignty, a righteous reclaiming of stolen land. The media, as it so often does, ran with the Venezuela escalates border dispute with Guyana over oil rights. A regional spat, they called it. A diplomatic flare-up. Nothing to see here. But here's what they didn't tell: this isn't just about a border. This is about the slow, grinding collapse of American hegemony in its own backyard. This is about Russia and China testing the limits of U.S. resolve in a part of the world Washington has long considered its exclusive domain. And most dangerously, this is about how the United States, distracted, divided, and desperate to reassert its dominance, might stumble into a conflict it doesn't want, with consequences no one has fully thought through. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of energy, geopolitics, and great power competition. I've watched as the U.S. has repeatedly misjudged the intentions of its adversaries, overestimated its own leverage, and underestimated the willingness of smaller states to play the great powers against one another. What's happening in Venezuela right now is a case study in all of those failures. And if we don't pay attention, we may wake up one day to find ourselves in a crisis that could have been avoided. The official what they want you to believe. The story, as it's being sold to the public, goes something like Venezuela, a failed state under the authoritarian grip of Nicolas Maduro, is lashing out at its neighbor Guyana over a long-standing territorial dispute. The Essequibo region, which makes up about 2/3 of Guyana's landmass, has been a point of contention since the 19th century, but tensions flared in 2015 when ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in Guyanese waters. Since then, Venezuela has periodically reasserted its claim, but this time, Maduro has gone further than ever before, holding a referendum in December 2023 where Venezuelans overwhelmingly voted to annex the territory, followed by the deployment of troops to the border and the announcement of plans to issue oil licenses in the disputed zone. The U.S. response has been predictable. The State Department issued a statement reaffirming its support for Guyana's sovereignty. The Pentagon conducted joint military exercises with the Guyanese Defense Force. And President Biden, in a move that should surprise no one, framed the dispute as yet another front in the global struggle between democracy and autocracy. The United States stands with our partners in the Western Hemisphere, he said in a press briefing last month. We will not tolerate threats to the territorial integrity of our allies. The media has largely echoed this framing. The New York Times ran a piece titled "Venezuela's Aggression Tests U.S. Commitment to Guyana," while the Washington Post warned of Maduro's actionist ambitions. Even the usually sober Financial Times described the situation as a test of Washington's resolve in its own backyard. The message is Venezuela is the aggressor, Guyana is the victim, and the U.S. is the indispensable power keeping the peace. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not wrong, exactly. Venezuela is the aggressor here, and Maduro is a thug who has presided over the collapse of his country's economy and the repression of its people. But the story being told is so narrow, so stripped of context, that it obscures the real forces at play. And if we don't understand those forces, we won't see the coming storm until it's too late. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the most obvious: why now? Venezuela has claimed the Essequibo for decades. Why is Maduro suddenly making a move when his country is in shambles, his regime is isolated, and his people are starving? The answer, as it so often is in geopolitics, is oil. But not in the way you might think. Yes, the Essequibo is rich in oil. Guyana's offshore fields are among the most lucrative in the world, with proven reserves of over 11 billion barrels. But Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves on the planet, an estimated 300 billion barrels. The problem isn't that Venezuela needs more oil. The problem is that it can't sell the oil it has. U.S. sanctions, imposed in 2019, have crippled Venezuela's ability to export crude, cutting off its primary source of revenue. Maduro's regime is desperate for cash, and the only way to get it is to find a way around those sanctions. Enter Russia and China. For years, Moscow and Beijing have been propping up Maduro's government, providing loans, buying Venezuelan oil at discounted rates, and helping Caracas evade U.S. restrictions. But in the last 18 months, something has changed. The war in Ukraine has forced Russia to redirect its energy exports, leaving Venezuela with fewer buyers. China, meanwhile, has grown increasingly frustrated with Maduro's inability to stabilize his country's economy. Both powers have made it if Venezuela wants their continued support, it needs to do something to prove its value. That's where the Essequibo comes in. Here's what the mainstream media isn't telling: Maduro's move isn't just about grabbing territory. It's about creating leverage. By escalating the dispute, he's forcing the U.S. to either back down or double down. If Washington blinks, if it offers sanctions relief in exchange for de-escalation, Maduro wins. He gets the breathing room he needs to keep his regime afloat. If the U.S. doesn't blink, he can frame himself as a nationalist hero standing up to American imperialism, rallying domestic support and giving Russia and China an excuse to deepen their involvement. And that's exactly what's happening. In the weeks following Venezuela's referendum, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov made a point of visiting Caracas. Officially, the trip was about strengthening bilateral ties. Unofficially, sources tell me, the Russians made it clear that if Venezuela pushed harder on the Essequibo, Moscow would provide military support, intelligence, weapons, even the deployment of advisors to the border. Meanwhile, China has quietly increased its purchases of Venezuelan oil, using middlemen to mask the transactions. And just last week, reports emerged that Iran, another U.S. adversary, has offered to help Venezuela develop its military capabilities in the region. This isn't just a border dispute. It's a proxy play. And the U.S. is walking right into it. The broader geopolitical how we got here. To understand why this matters, we need to out. What's happening in Venezuela isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger struggle, the unraveling of the post-Cold War order and the return of great power competition. For the last 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could maintain unchallenged dominance in its own hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, that 19th-century relic, was dusted off and repurposed for the 21st century. Latin America was supposed to be Washington's backyard, a region where no outside power could gain a foothold without facing severe consequences. And for a while, that worked. The Soviet Union collapsed. China was still a developing country. Russia was weak and inward-looking. But that world is gone. Today, we live in a multipolar system where the U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. Russia, despite its economic struggles, remains a nuclear-armed state with global ambitions. China, now the world's second-largest economy, is actively challenging U.S. influence in every region, including Latin America. And both powers have made it clear that they will not accept American hegemony in what they see as their own spheres of influence. This is where the hypocrisy becomes glaring. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades lecturing the world about the inviolability of borders, Ukraine, Taiwan, the South China Sea. But when it comes to its own backyard, Washington has a long history of ignoring that principle. The 1983 invasion of Grenada. The 1989 invasion of AMA. The 2004 coup in Haiti. The 2009 coup in Honduras. The 2019 attempt to overthrow Maduro himself. The message has always been do as we say, not as we do. Now, Russia and China are calling that bluff. They see Venezuela as an opportunity, a weak state in America's neighborhood where they can test U.S. resolve without risking direct confrontation. If they can force Washington to back down in the Essequibo, its sense of the Monroe Doctrine is dead. The U.S. can no longer dictate terms in its own hemisphere. And if the U.S. doesn't back down? Well, that's even better. Because then they get to watch America get bogged down in another endless, unwinnable conflict, draining its resources and attention while they exert their influence elsewhere. This is classic great power politics. And the U.S. is playing right into their hands. Military and strategic, the risks of escalation. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where things get dangerous. The U.S. has already begun ramping up its presence in the region. In December, the Pentagon announced that it would conduct routine military exercises with Guyana, including air and maritime patrols. The USS Burke, a guided missile destroyer, was deployed to the area. And just last week, the U.S. Southern Command held a press briefing where they warned that Venezuela's actions threaten regional stability and that the U.S. was prepared to respond. On the surface, this looks like a measured response. But here's the Guyana has no military to speak of. Its defense force consists of about 3,000 active duty personnel, with no air force and a navy that operates a handful of patrol boats. Venezuela, by contrast, has over 120,000 active duty troops, a functional air force, and a navy that, while outdated, is still capable of projecting power in the region. This is not a fight Guyana can win on its own. And that means if Venezuela decides to invade, the US will have no choice but to intervene directly. Now, I'm not saying war is inevitable. But the risk of miscalculation is real. And the history of US military interventions in Latin America is not encouraging. Remember Iraq? Afghanistan? Libya? In each case, the US went in with the assumption that it could quickly and decisively resolve the conflict, only to find itself mired in a quagmire. Venezuela is not Iraq. It's not Afghanistan. But it is a country with a population of 28 million, a vast and difficult terrain, and a regime that has spent the last decade preparing for asymmetric warfare. If the US gets dragged into a conflict there, it will not be quick. It will not be easy. And it will not end well. And that's before we even consider the possibility of Russian or Chinese involvement. If Moscow or Beijing decide to provide Venezuela with advanced weaponry, anti-air systems, drones, even cyber capabilities, the US could find itself in a proxy war with two nuclear-armed powers in its own hemisphere. That's not a scenario anyone should want. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Of course, none of this happens in a vacuum. The US response to Venezuela isn't just about geopolitics. It's also about domestic politics. Let's be Joe Biden is not in a strong position heading into the 2024 election. His approval ratings are underwater. The economy is shaky. And the Democratic Party is deeply divided. In times like these, presidents have a tendency to look for foreign policy wins, quick, decisive actions that can rally the base and project strength. Venezuela is an easy target. Maduro is a villain the American public loves to hate. The idea of standing up to a socialist dictator plays well with both the Democratic base and swing voters in Florida, a state that could decide the election. And if the US can force Venezuela to back down, it's a low-risk, high-reward move. But here's the it's not low risk. If the US escalates and Venezuela calls its bluff, Biden will be forced to either back down, which would be a humiliation, or double down, which could lead to a conflict no one wants. And if that happens, the political fallout could be devastating. We've seen this movie before. In 2019, Donald Trump's administration pushed for regime change in Venezuela, imposing crippling sanctions and even recognizing opposition leader Juan Guaidó as the country's legitimate president. The result? Maduro is still in power, the Venezuelan people are worse off, and the US has been left with egg on its face. Biden is smarter than Trump. He knows the risks. But he's also under pressure from hawks in his own party, people like Senator Bob Menendez, who has been pushing for a harder line on Venezuela for years. And if the situation escalates, those voices will only grow louder. This is how wars start. Not with a grand strategy, but with a series of small, incremental steps, each one seemingly reasonable, each one leading inexorably toward disaster. Scenario: what comes next? So where do we go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, the US and its allies manage to de-escalate the situation through diplomacy. The Biden administration offers Maduro a face-saving off-ramp, perhaps a promise of sanctions relief in exchange for a commitment to resolve the dispute through international arbitration. Russia and China, seeing no advantage in further escalation, pressure Maduro to back down. The crisis fades, and the status quo is preserved. This is the outcome everyone should want. But it's also the least likely. Why? Because Maduro has no incentive to compromise. His regime is desperate, and he knows that the longer the crisis drags on, the more leverage he has. Meanwhile, the US is unlikely to offer meaningful sanctions relief without a major concession, something Maduro is unwilling to give. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. In this scenario, the standoff continues, but neither side is willing to pull the trigger. Venezuela makes provocative moves, issuing oil licenses in the disputed zone, conducting military exercises near the border, but stops short of outright invasion. The US responds with symbolic shows of force, more military exercises, more sanctions, but avoids direct confrontation. Russia and China continue to provide support, but they, too, stop short of direct military involvement. This is the frozen conflict scenario. It's not ideal, but it's manageable. The problem is that frozen conflicts have a way of thawing at the worst possible moment. And if either side miscalculates, we could quickly find ourselves in Scenario 3. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. In this scenario, Venezuela invades. It doesn't have to be a full-scale assault, just enough to establish a foothold in the Essequibo, perhaps seizing a key oil installation or a strategic border town. The US, caught off guard, responds with airstrikes or a limited military intervention. Russia and China, seeing an opportunity to humiliate the US, increase their support for Venezuela, perhaps even deploying advisors or providing advanced weaponry. This is where things get really dangerous. Because once the shooting starts, it's very hard to stop. And if the US finds itself in a direct conflict with Russian or Chinese forces, even indirectly, the risk of escalation becomes very real. I've studied enough history to know that wars rarely go according to plan. The US may think it can contain the conflict, but once the bullets start flying, all bets are off. Grand strategy: the decline of American hegemony. This brings me to the bigger picture. What's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the slow, painful unraveling of American global dominance. For the last 30 years, the US has pursued a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its unmatched power to shape the world in its own image. Democracy promotion. Free trade. Military alliances. Humanitarian interventions. The goal was to create a world where American values and American interests were one and the same. It hasn't worked. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were disasters. The color revolutions in the former Soviet Union backfired. The pivot to Asia has been half-hearted and ineffective. And now, as the US struggles to maintain its influence in Latin America, we're seeing the limits of that strategy. The problem isn't that the US is weak. It's that the world has changed. The unipolar moment is over. We now live in a multipolar system where power is diffuse, where regional players have more agency, and where the US can no longer dictate outcomes. This is a hard truth for many in Washington to accept. But it's a truth we ignore at our peril. The alternative to liberal hegemony isn't isolationism. It's realism, a grand strategy that recognizes the limits of American power and focuses on managing great power competition rather than trying to dominate it. That means accepting that Russia and China will have spheres of influence. It means working with regional powers rather than dictating to them. And it means avoiding unnecessary conflicts that drain resources and attention from the real strategic challenges, like China's rise in the Indo-Pacific. Venezuela is a perfect example of what happens when we don't do that. The US has spent the last 2 decades treating Latin America as an afterthought, only to be caught flat-footed when Russia and China move in. And now, we're scrambling to respond, with no clear strategy and no endgame in sight. This is how empires decline. Not with a bang, but with a series of miscalculations, each one more costly than the last. Alternatives and what we should do instead. So what should the US do? How? Do we avoid repeating the same mistakes in Venezuela and, more broadly, in the global competition for influence that's reshaping the 21st century? First, we need to stop pretending that sanctions are a magic bullet. The US has imposed economic restrictions on Venezuela since 2017, with the Trump administration escalating to a full oil embargo in 2019. The results? Venezuela's GDP has collapsed by over 75% since 2013, but Maduro remains in power, and the country's oil exports, now rerouted through Russia, China, and even Iran, have actually increased in recent years. The U.S. Treasury's own data shows that Venezuela's oil production, while still far below its 2015 peak, has stabilized at around 800,000 barrels per day, much of it flowing to India and China via intermediaries. Sanctions didn't topple the regime, they just forced it into the arms of America's adversaries. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader erosion of U.S. financial dominance. When the U.S. weaponizes the dollar through sanctions, secondary restrictions, or threats to cut off access to SWIFT, it accelerates the search for alternatives. Russia and China have spent the last decade building parallel financial systems, from the CIPS payment network to bilateral trade in local currencies. Iran and Venezuela have followed suit, using barter deals and cryptocurrencies to evade U.S. oversight. The more the U.S. relies on economic coercion, the faster the dollar's reserve status weakens. And once that happens, America's ability to project power militarily, economically, diplomatically will decline with it. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. is still thinking in 20th century terms, where economic pressure was enough to force compliance. But in a multipolar world, adversaries have options. Russia can sell oil to India in rupees. China can lend to Venezuela in yuan. Iran can trade with Syria using gold-backed digital currencies. The U.S. can't sanction its way out of this problem because the targets of those sanctions no longer need the U.S. financial system to survive. Second, we need to recognize that military intervention is off the table, and not just because the American public has no appetite for another war. The geopolitical costs would be catastrophic. Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a NATO partner, and Guyana, where ExxonMobil has made massive offshore oil discoveries. A U.S. invasion would trigger a regional crisis, giving Russia and China a pretext to deepen their military presence in the Western Hemisphere. We've already seen this playbook in Syria, where Russian and Iranian forces used the chaos of civil war to entrench themselves. Venezuela would be worse. Moscow has already sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan forces. Beijing has sold drones and radar systems to Caracas. If the U.S. moves militarily, we're not just fighting Maduro, we're fighting a proxy war with Russia and China on our own doorstep. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. has spent the last 20 years fighting insurgencies in the Middle East, where the rules of engagement were murky and the objectives were unclear. But great power competition is different. It's about deterrence, not regime change. It's about denying adversaries footholds, not occupying countries. And right now, the U.S. is failing at both. Russia and China are extending their influence in Latin America not because they're stronger than the U.S., but because they're more focused. They don't care about democracy or human rights. They care about access to markets, access to resources, access to strategic geography. And they're willing to play the long game. Third, we need to stop treating Latin America as a monolith. The region is fracturing along ideological and economic lines, and the U.S. keeps misreading the signals. Take Brazil. Under Lula, Brazil has pursued a non-aligned foreign policy, balancing relations with the U.S., China, and Russia. Mexico, under AMLO, has done the same, refusing to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine while quietly benefiting from nearshoring. Even Colombia, America's closest ally in the region, has elected a leftist president who's skeptical of U.S. influence. The idea that the U.S. can rally Latin America against Venezuela is a fantasy. The region is too divided, too pragmatic, and too wary of American overreach. So what's the alternative? It starts with humility. The U.S. needs to accept that it can't dictate outcomes in Latin America or anywhere else. That doesn't mean disengaging. It means competing smarter. Instead of sanctions that push Venezuela into Russia's arms, we should offer conditional engagement, lifting restrictions in exchange for democratic reforms, not regime change. Instead of lecturing Latin American leaders about democracy, we should focus on shared countering drug trafficking, securing supply chains, and managing migration. And instead of treating China's presence in the region as an existential threat, we should recognize that Beijing's investments come with strings-attached debt traps, environmental damage, and corruption that many Latin American countries are starting to resent. Here's the bottom: the US is still the most powerful country in the world, but its margin of error is shrinking. Every miscalculation, every failed coup, every overreach, every unnecessary confrontation weakens its position. Venezuela isn't just a crisis. It's a warning. The question is whether Washington will heed it before the next one comes. Because if history is any guide, the next crisis won't be in Latin America. It'll be in the Taiwan Strait, or the South China Sea, or Eastern Europe. And by then, the US won't have the luxury of learning from its mistakes. It'll have to live with them. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just an external geopolitical chess piece, it's a domestic powder keg with a lit fuse. The establishment narrative in Washington and Brussels treats Maduro as a cartoonish villain, a tin-pot dictator clinging to power through sheer brutality. But that's a dangerous oversimplification. The reality is that Venezuela's political system is far more resilient and far more fragmented than outsiders understand. And if we're not careful, the next phase of this crisis won't be a clean transition to democracy or a US-backed coup. It'll be a slow-motion implosion that drags the region into something far uglier. Let me explain why this matters. Since 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with US backing, the international community has been operating under the assumption that Maduro's regime is a house of cards. The logic was squeeze the economy with sanctions, isolate the government diplomatically, and wait for the military to flip. But here's the uncomfortable: it didn't work. Not because Maduro is popular, he's not, but because the system he presides over isn't a traditional dictatorship. It's a hybrid of authoritarianism, criminal enterprise, and revolutionary nostalgia, held together by a mix of coercion, patronage, and sheer inertia. Take the military, for example. The assumption in Washington was that the generals would abandon Maduro once the money ran out. But that calculation ignored two critical factors. First, the Venezuelan military isn't just a professional fighting force, it's an economic empire. The armed forces control everything from food imports to gold mining, from oil smuggling to currency exchange. In 2020, the U.S. Treasury estimated that the military's business interests generated at least $1.2 billion annually in illicit revenue. That's not pocket change in a collapsed economy. Second, the regime has spent years purging dissenters and promoting loyalists. Since 2014, Maduro has replaced over 60% of the high-ranking officer corps with figures tied to his inner circle. The result? A military that's less a national institution and more a personal protection racket. Then there's the opposition. The narrative in Western capitals is that Guaidó's failure was a tactical misstep, that the next leader will be more competent, more charismatic, more capable of uniting the fractured anti-Chavista forces. But that misses the point. The opposition's problem isn't just leadership, it's structural. Venezuela's political class is divided between exiles in Miami, pragmatists in Caracas, and radicals who still believe in the revolution's original ideals. The 2024 presidential election is a perfect example. The opposition managed to unite behind a single candidate, Edmundo González, but only after years of infighting and a last-minute deal brokered by Maria Corina Machado, who was barred from running herself. Even then, the unity is fragile. Machado's hardline stance, she's called for a complete dismantling of the Chavista state, alienates moderates who fear a post-Maduro Venezuela could descend into chaos or even civil war. Here's where the scenario projections get dark. The most likely outcome in the short term isn't regime change or a negotiated transition. It's a prolonged stalemate, where Maduro clings to power through a mix of repression and controlled liberalization. The regime has already shown it can adapt. After the 2018 election, which was widely condemned as fraudulent, Maduro allowed a limited economic opening, lifting price controls and easing restrictions on foreign currency. The result? A modest recovery in 2021 and 2022, with GDP growing by 8% and 4% respectively, the first action in nearly a decade. It wasn't enough to restore living standards, but it was enough to take the edge off public anger. The regime also co-opted parts of the opposition, allowing some dissidents to participate in local elections in exchange for dropping calls for international intervention. But this isn't stability. It's a pressure valve. The underlying economic crisis is still there. Hyperinflation may have eased, but real wages are a fraction of what they were in 2013. The state's capacity to deliver basic services has collapsed. In 2023, the UN reported that 7.7 million Venezuelans were food insecure, and over 90% of the population lived in poverty. The only thing keeping the lid on is mass emigration. Over 7 million people have left since 2015, according to the UN. That's nearly a quarter of the population. And here's the most of those who remain are either too poor to leave or too invested in the system to risk rebellion. So what happens if the pressure builds again? The most dangerous scenario isn't a popular uprising, it's a split within the regime. The Chavista elite isn't monolithic. There are hardliners like Diosdado Cabello, who still believe in the revolution's socialist ideals, and pragmatists like Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who recognize that the current model is unsustainable. If Maduro's health deteriorates, or if he's forced out by a palace coup, those factions could turn on each other. We saw a preview of this in 2018, when Maduro survived an assassination attempt using drones. The regime blamed Colombia and the US, but many analysts believe it was an inside job, a warning from hardliners to Maduro not to make concessions. The other wild card is the military. If the economy collapses again, or if the US imposes even harsher sanctions, the generals might decide that Maduro is more of a liability than an asset. But here's they won't hand power to the opposition. They'll install one of their own, someone like Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who's already been sanctioned by the US for drug trafficking. That wouldn't be a transition to democracy. It would be a military junta with a revolutionary veneer, propped up by Russia and China, and just as hostile to the US as Maduro is now. And that's the scenario that keeps me up at night. Not because it's inevitable, but because it's the most likely outcome if the US and its allies keep treating Venezuela as a geopolitical football rather than a country on the brink. The establishment narrative in Washington is that time is on our side, that sanctions and isolation will eventually force Maduro out. But time isn't on anyone's side. Every day that passes, Venezuela's institutions erode a little more. The state's monopoly on violence is weakening. Criminal gangs, Colombian guerrillas, and even rogue military units are carving out their own fiefdoms. In 2023, the Venezuelan Observatory of Violence reported that the country had the highest homicide rate in South America, with 40.4 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. That's not just a crime problem, it's a symptom of a state that's losing control. So what's the alternative? It's not pretty, but it's realistic. The US and its allies need to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term. That doesn't mean giving up on democracy, it means playing the long game. Instead of pushing for regime change, we should focus on containing the crisis. That means targeted sanctions that hurt the regime's inner circle, not the population. It means working with Latin American countries to manage migration flows, rather than treating them as a security threat. And it means offering conditional engagement, lifting some sanctions in exchange for electoral reforms, not a wholesale surrender. The most immediate test will be the 2024 election. If Maduro allows a relatively free and fair vote, the US should be prepared to ease some restrictions. If he steals it, the response should be swift but measured, no military threats, no coup plots, but a coordinated diplomatic and economic squeeze. The goal isn't to topple Maduro. It's to make it clear that the cost of repression outweighs the benefits. Here's the hard: Venezuela isn't a problem that can be solved. It's a crisis that needs to be managed. And if we don't manage it, it will manage us. Because the longer this goes on, the more likely it becomes that Venezuela's collapse won't just be a humanitarian disaster. It'll be a geopolitical one, pulling in Colombia, Brazil, the US, Russia, and China in ways no one can predict. And by then, it won't just be about Venezuela. It'll be about the future of the Western Hemisphere and whether the US still has the credibility to shape it. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just a failure of governance, it's a failure of grand strategy, both in Caracas and Washington. The Maduro regime has survived not because it's strong, but because it's mastered the art of playing weaker hands better than its adversaries. Meanwhile, the US and its allies have oscillated between neglect and overreach, treating Venezuela as either a nuisance or a target, never as a problem that demands sustained, strategic engagement. That's a mistake. Because in geopolitics, the most dangerous crises aren't the ones you see coming, they're the ones you ignore until they're too big to handle. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The country's collapse isn't just spilling over into Colombia and Brazil, it's reshaping the entire regional security architecture. Take the case of the ELN, Colombia's last major guerrilla group. In 2022, the U.S. Treasury Department designated the ELN as a transnational criminal organization, citing its deep ties to Venezuela's government. That's not hyperbole. The ELN operates openly in Venezuelan territory, controlling gold mines in Bolivar State and running protection rackets in Taquira. In 2023, Colombian intelligence reported that the ELN had exited its presence in Venezuela by 40% in just 2 years. That's not a fringe group, it's a quasi-state actor, and it's being enabled by Maduro's regime. The reason? The ELN provides Maduro with a deniable proxy force to destabilize Colombia, while also serving as a revenue stream through illegal mining. It's a symbiotic relationship, and it's turning Venezuela into a safe haven for armed groups that threaten the entire Andean region. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has no coherent strategy to counter this. The Biden administration's approach has been a mix of half-hearted sanctions, sporadic diplomatic pressure, and a refusal to engage directly with the regime. That's not strategy, that's improvisation. And improvisation in geopolitics is how you end up with crises like the 2019 Lima Group debacle, where a coalition of Latin American nations and Canada tried to isolate Maduro, only to fracture when Mexico and Argentina pulled back under new leftist governments. The result? Maduro outlasted them all. He's still in power, the ELN is stronger than ever, and the US is left scrambling to respond. So what's the alternative? It's not about choosing between engagement and isolation, it's about recognizing that both have failed, and that a new approach is needed. I call it containment with teeth. The goal isn't to overthrow Maduro or prop him up, it's to prevent Venezuela's crisis from metastasizing into a regional conflict. That means 3 things. First, the US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a bilateral issue and start treating it as a regional one. That means working with Brazil, Colombia, and even Mexico to create a coordinated response. Brazil's Lula has been reluctant to confront Maduro directly, but he's also acutely aware of the risks of a failed state on his northern border. In 2023, Brazil's intelligence agency, ABN, reported that Venezuelan criminal gangs were exiting into Roraima state, smuggling weapons and drugs. That's a direct threat to Brazilian sovereignty, and Lula knows it. The US should leverage that concern, not by demanding Brazil take a harder line, but by offering intelligence sharing and logistical support to secure the border. It's a carrot, not a stick, and it's the kind of pragmatic diplomacy that actually works. Second, the US needs to rethink its sanctions regime. Right now, sanctions are a blunt instrument, they hurt the Venezuelan people more than they hurt the regime. That's not just morally indefensible, it's strategically stupid. The US should shift to targeted sanctions that focus on the regime's revenue: gold, oil, and cryptocurrency. In 2022, the US Treasury sanctioned Venezuela's state-owned gold mining company, Minervan, for its ties to the ELN and Russian mercenaries. That's a good start, but it's not enough. The US should also go after the financial networks that allow the regime to launder money through shell companies in AMA, the UAE, and even Europe. And it should work with allies to crack down on the cryptocurrency exchanges that Maduro's cronies use to evade sanctions. The goal isn't to strangle Venezuela's economy, it's to cut off the regime's lifelines. Third, the US needs to offer Maduro a way out, not of power, but of isolation. That means conditional lifting some sanctions in exchange for concrete steps, like allowing international observers for the 2024 election, releasing political prisoners, and cracking down on the ELN's presence in Venezuela. It's not about rewarding Maduro, it's about giving him an incentive to behave like a rational actor, not a desperate warlord. And if he refuses? Then the US and its allies should be prepared to escalate, not with military threats, but with a coordinated diplomatic and economic squeeze. The key is to make it clear that the cost of repression outweighs the benefits of cooperation. Now, I know what some of you are, this sounds like appeasement. It's not. Appeasement is what the US did in the 1930s, when it ignored Hitler's aggression until it was too late. This is the opposite. It's about recognizing that Venezuela's crisis is already a threat to regional stability, and that the only way to contain it is through a mix of pressure and diplomacy. The alternative, continuing the current policy of half measures and wishful thinking, is a recipe for disaster. Let me put this in historical perspective. In the 1980s, the U.S. faced a similar crisis in Central America, where civil wars in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala threatened to destabilize the entire region. The Reagan administration's response was a mix of military aid, covert operations, and diplomatic pressure. It was messy, it was controversial, and it didn't always work. But it prevented those conflicts from spiraling out of control. Today, the U.S. needs a similar approach in Venezuela, not because it's the perfect solution, but because the alternatives are worse. Here's the bottom: Venezuela isn't just a humanitarian tragedy. It's a geopolitical time bomb. And if the US and its allies don't start treating it that way, they'll wake up one day to find that the bomb has already gone off. The question isn't whether Venezuela's collapse will pull in outside powers, it's which ones, and how far they're willing to go. Russia and China are already deeply involved, using Venezuela as a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Iran is extending its influence through oil-for-food deals and military cooperation. And if the US continues to dither, it won't just be Maduro calling the shots, it'll be Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. That's not a future anyone should want. But it's the future we're heading toward if we don't change course. The good news is that it's not too late. The bad news is that time is running out. Venezuela's crisis is no longer a problem that can be ignored or wished away. It's a challenge that demands a serious, sustained, and strategic response. And if we don't provide one, someone else will. And we won't like the results.